Hey, it's Travis. Too many camp directors run just on gut feel. Our free Resilient Camp Blueprint Diagnostic is your dashboard for resilience. Take it today at camp.mba/Travis. Again, that's camp.mba/Travis.
A big thanks to our sponsors who make the pudding possible. The American Camp Association of Illinois is made up of nearly 289,000 members, volunteers, campers, families, and professionals who believe in the power of camp. They work to disrupt the effects of poverty by providing fundamental services for children and families and learning opportunities for camp professionals. Learn more about ACA Illinois by visiting acail.org. You know the impact you want to make in a child's life, but figuring out the day-to-day details can be overwhelming. Let Camptivities help you make that impact by streamlining the creation of your camp activity schedules. Schedule a demo at camptivities.com.
Welcome to the pudding.
The sweet proof of research to back up what you already know about camp. Hi, I'm Dr. Mandi Baker, and my pronouns are she, her.
I'm Travis Allison, he, him, and il. Today, we're going to explore power between people. Mandi, this is a zinger. Where do you want to start us off?
Right, it is. Look, I think we need to start with some conceptual unpacking.
Sure.
So apologies if it gets a little academic, but there's lots and lots of different theories about power. And when we're talking about power, we're talking about who has influence amongst relationships, in and amongst relationships, and why they have influence, and that we're going to tie this all back into camp in terms of how relationships, how people negotiate these relationships that have influence, that have power in them. So, have you ever heard of a guy called Foucault, Michel Foucault?
Yes. Yep.
Look, for a lot of sociologists, a lot of university students who have to learn some intro Foucault, he's a dirty word. And part of it is because he's French.
Yeah.
He's very intense, and he used to speak and write in a very prose-like manner. And so if you know much about the French language, often the sentence is back to front. So it's much more poetic. And so he's hard to follow. I'm probably going to dishonor his work in some ways by trying to simplify it into easier language today. So keep in mind that his work's very nuanced. But he brought us this really cool idea about power, about how power works. So I guess the first step is to acknowledge that there's an assumption that people in authority have power.
Right.
And I think that's a fairly reasonable assumption, but that takes us back to leadership literature that says to be a leader, you actually have to have followers. And there are different ways of getting followers. If you don't follow a leader, somebody who self-declares, I'm a leader, and nobody follows them, they're actually not a leader because they're not leading anything or anyone. The followership is a key ingredient to leadership, and that's really important in camps. You would know this, all that leadership training you guys do.
Yeah.
In older styles of governing, leadership or that influence was gained through fear, through threat, through harm. So even the threat of harm causes people to go, all right, I'll do what you say because I don't want to have that thing done to me, that consequence to me that's happening to my neighbor.
Right. Yeah.
And that's an incredibly powerful technique in camps with kids or discipline. Like if you have kids, if you discipline one child, and when I say discipline, I don't mean negative, straight up and down. I'm talking about like creating boundaries and holding them by having consequence, whatever those happen to be. If you discipline one kid, all the other kids around them go, ooh, better not do that dumb thing. I'll get myself in trouble and it won't be fun.
Yeah.
So when we think about times where church and state were still together, so we're talking about a couple centuries ago, there was a lot of harm and a lot of threat of harm. And that really made people what Foucault calls docile. So that real sort of, okay, I'll just be compliant. I'll be compliant. Docility was sought for. Don't think for yourself. Don't question a thing. Don't rebel. Don't resist. You just go, yeah, because I don't want that bad thing to happen to me. Those techniques still very much exist in our relationships and how people gain power, but it's far less sort of like blanket black and white rules across a whole society. It's much more insidious in between people and the individual people. And our great critical theorists will also tell you a lot of that negotiating and working out power also exists in things like policies, artifacts, rituals, practices, and space. So I'm often saying things to people like, space speaks. It does. It sends a message. But the message is telling you what's okay and what's not okay, what's good and what's bad. And Foucault got really famous he believed he was a historian. He wanted to understand the history of ideas, not people. Like if you think of a family tree, and you're like, where did my ancestors come from?
Yeah.
He would do that about an idea.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So he'd be like, where did modern governance come from? Or some of his most famous work is like, he was like, how did we decide somebody was actually crazy? Right. I'm putting bunny ears on that for the listeners. Like, what makes good mentality and bad mentality? And who got to decide who that is? So he did a lot of studies, at the time they're called asylums, mental asylums. He did a lot of studies on prisons. So what makes a criminal? What makes a bad person who needs to be locked away? And he's probably most famous for The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, 2, and 3. There's a little bit of reading there. And he asked the question of, what makes one kind of sexuality or sexual orientation good and another one bad? And historically, we've taken our turns saying some kinds of sexuality was okay and some kinds aren't. And at the time, he was a gay man living in countries where it was criminal to be gay.
Right.
So it was not a surprise that after he'd done all that preliminary work, he kind of arrived at this place, and he did some of his best philosophizing there. It's very nuanced and complex, but quite beautiful in the sense of like, who gets to decide? Who's the person who sits on the chair and says, yep, yours is all right.
Yeah.
And yours is bad. We'll lock you up because that'll sort you out. Right.
Yeah.
So if we can start to think about power as something that everyone has.
Yep.
It exists in all our relationships, and it's constantly dynamic. So it's not like one person holds it and another person doesn't have it. They have varying degrees of power. Yeah.
Depending on the moment and the situation.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's how one of the best examples of seeing power in this way is unions, and what unions originally started as and what they're capable of doing.
Right.
It was the idea that if you're working a factory and you're on the ground level, you're on the assembly line, that, if you decide to rebel and just step back and not put that piece into the vehicle or whatever you're building, look, somebody else might be able to step in and do it for you or do it, to replace you. But if the whole assembly line steps back,
right,
the people at the top no longer have any bargaining chips. They can't just go like, just do it.
Right.
Like, no, we're not doing it until you sort out the problems we're having.
Yeah.
So again, that's shifting this idea of power. Well, one of the things Foucault did is he really explored the way that people actually guide their own behavior. So they govern their own selves. Mm-hmm. And so they're their own kind of judge on themselves, but in alignment with what the dominant governing force or the dominant society was wanting from them at the time.
Yeah.
And this was, have you heard of Bentham's panopticon? Have you ever heard of this thing?
Is that the prison?
Yeah.
Does
it
prison
is.
design? Yeah.
So it was a prison design.
Yeah.
Do you want to take this one?
Sure. Well, it's a prison design. It's and for pop culture reference, it was in the original Guardians of the Galaxy.
Awesome.
The design where there's a circular prison with a tower in the middle, where the guards can keep an eye on everybody. So the panopticon was the center with the windows all around, so they could see all things in their mind. But the guards are in the middle and can oversee more by being in the middle of things.
Right. So it reduces your need for a lot of staff. Your resources go down. The observers, the guards. Yeah. Your reason we're cutting costs. We're cutting costs. We're getting efficient with this. I was recently digging into this a little bit more to teach some students my class, and I found out that part of the architectural design was that it would be backlit too. So there was windows at the back of the prison cells, so that you could actually see where bodies were at all times. Sure. Yeah. And the other new addition or new newer addition to this this story is, if you're standing in the guard tower, there will be moments where you will have your back to the people you're trying to observe, and they can see that you have their back. So that would be a time to, act against the set of rules at the time.
Yeah.
Well, welcome mirrored glass into the story, and what we have is prisoners that can't see whether the guards are watching them or not. In fact, they don't even know if there's guards in the tower or not.
Yeah.
So your only option at that point to avoid whatever the consequence is to always act according to the set of social rules that are expected of you in that moment. And what that is called, big old, many-lettered word from Foucault, he calls that subjectification. It's when you become a subject to your own internal voice, and that internal voice has internalized and adopted the set of rules.
Gotcha.
So what happens in subjectification is that you become the governor of your own self.
Yeah. That takes the onus from outside and internalizes it, puts it on you to say, I have to follow these rules because of, in this case, I don't know when I'm going to be punished for not following the rules. I have no way of knowing. In fact,
I have no way of knowing. And some of those real basic psychology classes will tell you that when the rat or the hamster doesn't know, that's when they lose their minds the most. They're anxious, they're unsteady, and they just.
Right. And also part of that theory, because this was about control, which brings us back around to where we're going today, is that that anxiety about your own behavior is on purpose, I guess. It's
effective.
Before we push on, I will say my favorite podcast has an episode about the Panopticon. If you are a fan of 99% Invisible, they've had a great show, which I think was actually a guest, some other show episode. But anyway, 99% Visible, awesome show. Now I know about what Panopticons are, and I can keep up in conversation with Mandy.
Well, now everybody can, hopefully. But there we go. Yeah.
Do you have some new leadership team members this summer and a full plate of to-do list items? Let ACA Illinois and Michael Brandwine help. Send your new and returning leadership team members to the annual and globally popular Brandwine on Superstaff Supervision, the quick course on outstanding skills to coach, motivate, and bring out the best in staff. This virtual training brings all the creativity and toolbox-filled techniques that Michael is known for, but without having to pay for travel. This May 17th, leadership team camp staff from around the world will gather virtually to be trained on the 6 essential things that leadership team members must do every day to encourage, coach, and lead camp staff. Learn more and join us at acail.org/Michael Brandwine. Hurry, early bird ends April 1st.
So I think what you're trying to do is say that there are systems that are put in place that make us want to follow those systems, but put that on us to do it, so they don't have to be watching. Which in our case may be camp management. In this, to bring it back specifically to camp.
Yeah. Well, and that's often the systems part is what we would call in this practice, in this kind of theory, we call it discourses. And discourses can be discursive, so written or spoken, it's in a narrative, it's in a text, or it can be in practice. So it's that reminder that the habits that we keep in a camp also send messages, or it's in space, or it's our history. So in camps, there's a handful of discourses, systems of thinking that delineate out what makes for a good or bad camper, or a good or bad camp counselor, or a good or bad camp director. And without having a lot of discussion about it, not a lot of critical questioning, we adopt these expectations. We adopt them in our own voice. We speak them to ourselves in our own voice. And we have a general rule is we have a pretty bad habit of being critical of things that arrive to us in our own voice. We don't spend a lot of time going, hello, internal voice, where the heck did you come from?
Sure.
Because you're not really that helpful right now. We go, well, that's what I think or believe. So I must listen, that listen to your heart stuff. I'm not saying you shouldn't listen to your heart, but there are times when your heart is repeating, or your voice is repeating a message that isn't particularly helpful to you, didn't really come from you in the first place. And maybe you could leave that one behind and live a little happier. But this is the effectiveness of how relations of powers can work in big society or in bubble camp community, like in community, is that there's this sense of governing yourself in alignment with particular, what we call a dominant discourse. So what is the social norm of that group at the time? And so let's talk camp. Let's talk about all the way that discourses work. So I say space speaks. What do you think? What are some of the things at camp that are done that helps shape people's behaviors?
So let's pick dining hall.
Do it.
There are ways, even a more universal example that's not so overnight focused, like a whole assembly of the whole. So morning flagpole, if you're a camp and do that kind of thing, or drop kids off the bus and everyone gathers in a certain place before they do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what is often happening in places like dining halls? And there's some great research. There's a lady called Leslie Parrish who writes a book all about camp, the history of camps and how they've kind of come up and grown. And she'll talk about the fact that dining halls or those meeting places are actually at the center of the physical geography of the camp place.
Yeah.
So dining halls tend to be also on the highest point or with the most vantage, like the most view out the windows. You can see the most. Often administrative buildings or the staff cabins are in the center or have lots of windows. I've heard people call them, we lived in the fishbowl, and I'm like, like the language is explicit and we're still not picking up this idea. So the physical space of camp is often very panopticon.
Okay.
It's often very panopticon. And it has that sort of central viewing point, gathering point. It's like when dining halls have a platform, so you can stand up and look out across everybody.
Yes. Beth grew up at a camp where there was a high table for senior staff. It was elevated. You could only get there by being senior staff. It was something that people were directly or indirectly aspired to get to be at the high table.
And it works both ways. Like you're hearing it, right? So it's not just a point of surveillance, but it allows the people that are not at high table to look up and see who has authority and to desire it. And to desire, so even more incentive. It's not, I'm no longer doing this to avoid punishment. I'm doing this to gain reward. Sure. I want to get up to that big table. I want to be with the big kids. This happens rather than, I think I want to be clear that there's no judgment in it. From me anyways, it just is. This just is. There's an expression in French that's like, c'est comme ça. Like, it's just like that. It's the way that society and communities have developed and built themselves for ages. It's being it's more that let's lift it to the surface of awareness. Mm-hmm. And even this past week, I was talking about the ethic of care. Yeah. And the Latin base of the word care is not just about love and affection, which is what it's about. It doesn't have to be romantic love, but love and affection. But it's also about something called contemplation and consciousness. And that's the Latin conjugation of the word cura. It's about, when you truly care, it's lifting it up to consciousness. It's taking the time to contemplate. What are the effects of this thing? How does it work? So some other things about camp that help organize authority are things like the camp routine. Right. So, it's a busy place to be, and there's not a lot of time for contemplation. If you don't have time for contemplation, you don't have as much time to raise these questions and say, hey, did you realize that we've set up a very hierarchical strategy that actually, works to keep people docile and to block out any of those uncomfortable questions if they get raised at all? Yeah. When you have time, when you care and you have time for contemplation, you can also hear the hard questions.
Yeah.
Right. So we've got a system.
As a leader, when someone brings you a hard question, you're open to it because you have the space and the time. Yes.
Correct.
Instead of being the same caring leader, but who is completely overwhelmed, you don't have the mental space or the energy to consider a hard question. Excellent. Gotcha.
So you can hear it. I think it's important not to walk around condoning people with authority and recognizing there's a whole environment, a whole system that feeds into and shapes the possibility for contemplation and consciousness and care.
Yeah. So I don't know if this is too far out of what we're talking about, but I've been in Canada's north, where our three territories, two of them have had fairly recent elections, and both of their systems are set up on a consensus system. The elements of which are there are no parties. You elect a spot, so there's not a lot of population. Like one of our territories has 40,000 people, and it is a territory the size of the continental United States, and so there's a small number of electorates. I think it's 12 or 16. And there's no one like the rest of Canada. You elect the party and the leader of that party becomes the leader. But so there's no parties. You go in, you get elected. The group sits around and talks about what they want to accomplish. And then through a voting process, but a consensus voting process, they eventually end up with someone who becomes the premier. And then they elect people to be different ministerial responsibilities, be responsible for an area of government. But the interesting part is the consensus part, that the time is set aside, and that leadership can change. The system is built for leadership to change. And I think part of that means that, unlike other party politics in Canada, where the leader is not separately elected, because the change can happen easily, the leaders tend to not fight for it as much. It's not as tooth and nail. It's not their whole identity, leadership. And I've been thinking about that a lot, because I've been thinking about both the Northwest Territories and Nunavut have had recent elections that made me reconsider systems of how we, I don't know, how we lead, govern is not the right word for camp, but obviously we do govern in a way. We just wouldn't like to say it out loud.
Yeah, I mean, arguably, Foucault says governance is happening constantly. And it's why I say governance instead of government, because I think when I say government, people assume the systems, like arguably a democratic system that, where we elect folks and they speak on behalf of the people. But governance never goes away. And leadership, and by consequence, never goes away. There will always be people who will be leading. It's such a refreshing and hopeful in the sense that the territories are offering a different way of doing, and that different way of doing is also starting to surface and be part of the conversation of, hey, guess what, actually there are different options. And we are in a time that we call the postmodern or the neoliberal, and that's one of those wonderful academic words, where democracy in somewhere like Canada, the United States, is highly driven by the mentality of capitalism. So even its like philosophical intentions of being democratic has been somewhat lost, or rather evolved. Again, I trying to use that kind of neutral language of just saying observably it turned into something different. And a democracy that's based on a discourse of capitalism is very different than one that is not. So, I mean, when we talk about camps, yes, there's systems of governance, and those systems of governance are reinforced by a whole host of things, which includes our values. And some of those values come historically from the beginnings of camp, includes things like our policies. I used to analyze job contracts, the camp counselor contracts, as a way of looking for what are the discourses this camp specifically is actually trying to land. And if you can think about it this way, even your recruitment process is speaking to your employees about what is good and bad, what they can and can't do, what's going to cause consequence and what's going to cause reward. So all of these artifacts can come together to shape a message. And here's the catch. These messages are often not spoken or written or discussed. They're not explicit, they're implicit. And by consequence, some of the hurtfully bits of it's quite insidious. It's really hard to get your fingers on. So people will talk to me about, for example, emotional burnout, because that's kind of one of my things. And they don't feel like it's legitimate. And it's not because someone stood there and like gaslit them and said, you don't have those feelings. It's because it's a consequence of this system of governance that has been wildly internalized and never spoken of. And that's what this last paper about summer camp counselors was about, or summer camp leaders, was the internalization and what happens. And we call those sometimes technologies. So it's these tactics that we turn on ourselves that we don't necessarily recognize. And the two that we talked about in our last paper, which is a bit of a mind bender, but very, very camp focused, really, really our environment, was the idea of responsibilization and personalization. So personalization is the idea that you make the job about you make the job you, and you make yourself into the job.
Sure.
So rather than performing camp counselor,
Right.
I become the camp counselor.
Okay.
And there's some really great research that talks about this like shift in leadership on a corporate level as well, that it's leadership as identity. My identity is the leadership of this company. So that's a good example of this in the not camp world is when in Canada, teachers were being told that they couldn't post certain pictures on their Facebook during their summer holidays. Well, actually, that's a real blurring of the public and private sphere. That actually in your private sphere, when you're not at work, you don't really fall under the regulation of or the governance of your job, your employer.
Yeah.
And yet this idea that like CEOs, if they don't embody the brand, then they're a bad CEO or GM. They aren't the right kind of leader if they don't follow the values of the company in their off time. And so what happens is there's no off time. And that by itself is not particularly healthy or respectful, but that's also camp. So, often when I would read contracts, seasonal contracts, there would often be a list of rules for how you have to behave when you're off site.
Yes.
Yeah. And again, it's not trying to point a finger, but it's actually the people who are writing these contracts don't even realize they've crossed a line because this is so much camp culture. So that's the personalization one. The other one's responsibilization, which is the idea that the individual doing the job is solely and completely responsible for all the things, for the success and the failures. And in my research, that shows up as camp counselors saying things like, I feel like I failed if the kid's not having fun. Yeah. I feel like I failed if the kid's crying.
Right.
Now, every great parent will tell you, sometimes when your kid's crying is when you know you're being a good parent because you've held the boundary. You've like, hey, guess what? You can't just, stay up to midnight and, sip on pixie sticks or whatever. And the kid has a tantrum or, that's not fair. And you're the worst parent ever. I remember meeting a young guy. It's a joke in our house, a little 4-year-old. And I insisted that he cleaned up after he had a play with me. Yeah. And he was like, why do adults have to be so mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And in our house, we joke about that now. When I hold a boundary, I hold a line for the kids. Why do adults have to be so mean? We laughed and, we can move on. But that responsible piece is part of what drains camp staff because they truly feel that if a particular activity isn't 100%, if not everybody's having a great time, if they forgot to do a thing that was just really fun and silly, that they somehow let someone down. And I mean, we were joking about this past week. Nobody else noticed. Yeah. Most of the time, nobody else notices. But it's a discourse that gets into our heads. And an awful lot at camp. It's disproportional at camp.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Scheduling affects every camper and every staff member's summer. It's easy to make mistakes, and it takes a ton of time. Bottom line, scheduling is hard. But it doesn't have to be. Let Camptivities help you create a balanced and engaging schedule without the mistakes and without those long days and late nights. Here's what Camptivities has to offer: auto scheduling, camper scheduling, group scheduling, elective scheduling, manual adjustments, over 50 different reports, tons of customizable settings, and so much more. If you're looking for a better way to schedule this summer, they would love to show you the next big thing in camp. Visit camptivities.com to set up a time to chat. Let Camptivities help you get away from your desk and back out to camp.
So if I am a camp leader who's listening and thinking, I kind of get where we're going with this. What's the practical application, or how do I start to build, a better power relationship? And we have to admit that at a certain point it's going to be a power relationship because of the responsibility of the management. But what's that person doing?
And every relationship has power in it. It's about the uses of power, and rather than worrying about the disparity or the difference of power. Like if you're the camp director, you have more responsibilities. So by consequence, you have to exercise power in a particular way. What Foucault says to us is that power is dangerous. He doesn't say it's good or bad. And he's not trying to say dangerous is bad. He's just saying when you have power, you can go a lot of different directions with it, and you can cause harm, and it can be intended and unintended. So where do we go? Here's the funny thing about people like me who do micro level, everyday levels of sociology. The first thing I always encourage people to do is make space. It's to start to embrace an ethic of care. Again, Foucault wrote an amazing piece about the ethic of the care of the self. And he says, when you take care of yourself, it is not just your responsibility, but it is a duty. Because when you care for yourself, you can be in right relations with others and communities and the space around you. So arguably a nicer way or an easier way of thinking about it is a fire needs what? It needs fuel. It needs a spark. It needs oxygen. Yeah. We need to breathe. We have to have the space between the fuel too. And so my starting point for most is to intentionally build space in to your everyday during the busiest of seasons. No, this is not like your winter reflection time. This is middle of summer and it's chaos. And to make sure that you have time to calm your mind, to bring all the stress stimulus down, and to consider. And you guys talk about it as intentionality. You talk about it a lot. And I think that's key. But it's being open to and curious about what is good and what makes bad. Is this something I have the right to regulate or not? Can I lead through earning trust and respect versus the fear of threat or the dangle of reward? And so that's when you're writing that job description, look at it and say, is this something I truly have the right to regulate? And if they're not on campus and they're not being paid and they're not on site, this is maybe not your domain. They need to blow off their steam their own way in their own time. And as much as we'd like to say, don't do anything naughty or bad. I mean, they are young adults. We all make mistakes, that kind of stuff. But right up into the camp space, I would say like every day, making sure you have time to sit. You can do things like anonymous question box, camp staff drop-in time, but you have to be in the right headspace to receive, to be open, and to be curious. And curious does not mean you have to agree. We have a feisty generation of employees coming through. They have a lot of good suggestions. It doesn't always land in the best package. I've had a few of those moments with my own students. But as long as I'm open and curious, I usually can get to the heart of what the niggle was. What was the thing that upset them in the first place versus the way it's landing? And the things that upset them in the first place, there's usually something in it. There's something in it that I can really engage with and make sense out of and maybe make a shift about.
Right. I mean, is there a way that, what can you leave folks with? I mean, making space for themselves is great. Is there any other thing you want to leave folks with, a challenge or something that will help them reconsider how they're doing this summer?
Yeah, look, I'm a nerd. So the first thing I'm going to tell people to do is read. There is some of my research actually works through these stories in more nuance, but with more camp stories, more of the quotes from camp counselors themselves, so you can hear what that sounds like in their voice. So I have that it's called The Impossible Job, and it's written by myself and Wendy O'Brien. And I very much encourage people to think about those things. I would also encourage people to make a list of all the major touch points they have with their staff and their campers. But this usually turns up more in the relations with staff over the summer, and think through in each touch point. Have I had a contemplation moment? Have I brought to consciousness the relationship of power that's being navigated? Have I acknowledged to myself where my line is that I want to hold? And can I be more, the other part is, can I be more explicit? So can I be more clear about my expectations and by consequence, and invite response? Does this work? Does this make sense? Am I missing something? Am I not hearing something? So that's what I'd encourage.
Right. Yeah. There's so much to this, so much more to this for sure. But I thank you, Mandi, for talking us through it today and giving us some examples, and for everything you're doing on the pudding. I'm grateful.
Oh, likewise. I'm so thankful that we made this space and that we can have these chats. So Camp Pros, if you didn't know, now you know.
Go Camp Pro. way beyond the basics. Hey, it's Travis. Camp directors often tell me they're just too tired to take on anything new. That's exactly why my free Resilient Camp Blueprint Diagnostic exists. It doesn't add work, it shows you progress. Quick, free, repeatable, you'll know if your systems are paying off without the guesswork. Try it today at camp.mba/Travis. That's camp.mba/Travis.